Well, I'm here with my really good friend, John Blaker, and do you know we'd lost touch for a number of years, and just recently he reached out to me and he made connection, and I am so grateful to him for doing so because it's been an absolute pleasure to have several conversations with him and reminisce. We're becoming old geezers, aren't we, John? And reminiscing about the good old days or the not so good old days, and so that's been an absolute joy, and I'm so grateful to you, John, for being willing to just do this little interview about your journey and your experience. So thanks ever such a lot. Really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Wonderful. Now, John, as I was thinking about this, I was thinking about the first time you and I ever met, and I remember getting up that morning and going into church, and it's got to be, oh, it's a long time ago now, and you stuck out like a sore thumb, if the truth be known, because you came into church and you were sat right in the middle of my eye line, in the body of the congregation. And if truth be told, you looked pretty dreadful. I wouldn't have been at all surprised if you didn't smell that day, to be honest. You looked like you'd been sleeping rough. You didn't look great. And do you remember that day? Do you remember?
Absolutely. I recall back then I was in the grip of two addictions, alcohol and gambling, and was in a second marriage which was hanging on by a thread. And I'd been encouraged by my second wife, Laura, to go along that day, as nothing else seemed to be working for me. And I remember that my ego was so inflated that when the pastor, yourself, asked, hands up those who feel guilty or hypocritical, that I thought, well, I'm going to put my hand up and I don't care if everyone else can see me. And I was absolutely shocked by the fact that everybody's hands went up, and the effect it had on me, the immediate effect, was that sense of identification, a sense of belonging. The loneliness had been almost instantly been taken away from me, because I realized that I wasn't on my own anymore, and other people, for various reasons, were feeling exactly like I was. So it was encouraging from the get-go, Richard.
And I remember watching you put your hand up and in a way admiring you greatly, because new people in a new place among strangers don't normally do that sort of thing, and so I knew that something quite serious was going on, and over the course of the next, we sort of connected, didn't we? I mean, I felt that, and we started to journey together. I think we journeyed together about 6 or 7 years,
Yeah.
and I remember it being a bit of a roller coaster.
Yeah.
And sometimes I felt like I was sort of holding on to the back of the carriage, flapping in the wind behind you, and learning as I went along. But that first day, you were in a pretty dire and desperate situation. Do you mind sort of unpacking that a bit for us?
Yeah. I I didn't seem to have the ability to, once I picked up a drink or had a bet, I didn't seem to have the power to stop. And why was that? Why was that happening? I think deep down I'd always suffered with emotional immaturity, and I think I was using gambling and alcohol as a way of running away, really, not wanting to be accountable or responsible for anything. If I could lose myself in a casino where nobody was going to make great demands on me and say, shouldn't you be at home with your wife, or shouldn't you be at work, and just give me the counters to play with and escape into the dream world, then everything would be fine. The problem was when it was all over and I was out the door again, with no money, all of life problems were still there, and I just made it worse. And I was like the hamster on the wheel. And I think my problem was, Richard, I have to say this with a degree of embarrassment, because I managed to achieve 3 A levels at school before the age of 17. I honestly thought that gave me a passport to do life, and quite clearly it didn't. And it wasn't until I was ready to completely surrender and recognize that life, according to John, wasn't working out too well, and that there had to be some intervention. And I think coming along to church that morning was the start of the journey with you. And I have to say that you were the first person that I couldn't manipulate. I could sell a fridge to an Eskimo back then. And, I think that there was a big part of me wanted to get well, and I wanted to be a participant in the process, but I needed someone to really get hold of me, and you were the first person I ever met that clearly wasn't going to let me get away with anything, which was, in hindsight, what I needed. So I'm grateful for that day. Didn't
And
realise that.
and you know, I feel really privileged to have journeyed with you during that phase of your life, because it wasn't easy. It wasn't easy for you, was it, to have somebody that in a way was holding up a mirror to you and going, really,
Yeah,
come on. And
yeah,
and we journeyed through the process of, well, really, in some ways, the sort of first 3 or 4 steps of the 12-step, program that Alcoholics Anonymous and other related anonymouses
yeah,
espouse. And I remember you taught me so much, if the truth be known. But I remember we went through, that process of admitting that you were helpless against the addiction,
yeah,
recognizing your need of help, looking for the higher power. And we spent quite a lot of time describing and defining what that higher power was going to be, particularly for you, specifically. And then journeying into what a relationship with that higher power actually looked like.
yeah,
And along the way, because I was desperate to try and help you and didn't really know what I was doing, we got involved in something called Celebrate Recovery, which was a sort of Christianized version of the 12-step program, which
yeah,
I know you did that, but you also continued with AA.
yeah.
Tell us how, the conversations that you were having with me, Celebrate Recovery and AA, how that sort of melded together to create almost the sort of perfect cocktail's probably the wrong word to use, isn't it? The perfect, in a way, the perfect storm that led to release. Tell us how that worked.
I think how it worked for me was, I think the light bulb moment for me was, I always thought that alcohol and gambling was my problem. It wasn't. I was the problem. Um, Gambling and alcohol were just what I call my go-tos, the
Yeah,
symptoms.
yeah,
I needed to undergo a complete change, and come into faith as I did with you, and the 12-step program that you've mentioned. 1930s, two Americans, Dr. Bob and Bill W., a surgeon and a stockbroker. I mean, straight away, what does that tell you? A surgeon and a stockbroker. No respecter of intelligence is addiction, and you think 3A levels that you can shortcut this process, intellectualize it, do it your way. And I have to say, the introduction of the program into my life, admitting in step 1 that I was powerless, and step 2 told me that help was on offer if I would just keep an open mind to the idea that there would be a power greater that could restore me.
mm,
I remember it said that could restore me to a normal way of thinking and living, restore me to sanity. And I remember thinking, how dare they? That suggests that I'm insane. And then I reminded myself of some of my behaviors in addiction, in active addiction, and they quite clearly were the act of an insane person.
mm.
And in step 3, would I be willing to hand over, to hand it over to, the higher powers, something in which I trust implicitly, something that will never give me anything to do that I cannot realistically achieve, that wants what's best for me. And that it wasn't until I started following those steps, Richard, that my obsession to want to use alcohol and gambling as a way of coping with whatever life was going to throw at me began to evaporate,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
has continued to this day, really.
And I remember that so clearly when we had conversations surrounding all of that. And you said to, I remember one day you said to me, okay, so if Jesus is the higher power, what are the rules? What are the rules? What have I got to do?
Yeah,
As if some formula was going to actually help you to
yeah,
be liberated. And I said to you, there are no rules. And you look
yeah,
completely confused. And I said, what you've got to learn to do is listen to the voice
yeah,
of Jesus, and do what he says. And I remember we started exploring that. It took us quite a long time, I seem to remember. But I remember you saying to me that, why is it that Jesus speaks to me after I've taken the first drink? Do you remember
yeah.
that? And I
Yes,
said, I said to you, because you aren't listening hard enough. And
yeah.
and that began the journey that had some extraordinary moments in it. Do you remember that? And what impact did that have on you?
I remember the one day I was at work. My job at the time was a benefit fraud investigator, quite a responsible position in the civil service. And I remember, the nature of my work meant that I couldn't really be effective from behind the desk. So I had to be out and about, knocking on doors, watching people, following people. So it was easy to pick up my government issued black bag and shove some paperwork in there, and off I go. And had no intentions of going to work that day. I was heading down towards what I call the danger area of Portsmouth, where there were lots of public houses in a very close proximity and a casino. And I just just procrastinating really, but just delaying the inevitable. I stopped at the HMV shop, just pretending that I was looking for stuff, and you appeared and completely freaked me out, almost as if you knew what I was about to embark upon.
Yeah,
and,
yeah.
I think
Yeah,
that
that was it was a major moment, wasn't it?
yes.
And the reason why it was major, because I was sitting in my office, which was closer to the outskirts of Portsmouth, where we both were living, close to Havant, and I got this strong sense that I was supposed to get out of my seat and go outside, and I went outside, and a bus pulled up, and this strong sense of leading that I should get on the bus. I had no idea where I was going, or even why I was doing it. It just seemed like craziness, really. And as I was going along, I didn't even know where I was supposed to get off. And then this strong sense that I should get off, I think it was one or two stops before the end of, where the bus's destination. And I got off and walked down and round the corner, and there was HMV. And I went and stood in HMV and thinking, what on earth am I here for? What's this about? And you walked in, looked like somebody, like you'd run into a wall, really. So shocked. And you said, "What are you doing here?" And I said, "Well, I think I'm here to see you."
You
and
don't
so,
like music. I think I said something very rude.
What did you say? Go on.
I must have had a preconceived idea that you weren't a music fan. So what were you doing in there?
Yeah, well, that is true. Not like you were a music fan.
That's
I mean,
right,
yours was OCD, but that's
yes,
to be expected, I suppose. But yeah, that was for me, that was a monumental moment, and it was obviously quite a helpful moment to you, since you remembered it all these years later. I'll tell you the one that really stands out for me, because I think that in many respects was me listening to the voice of the higher power and doing what he says. This one is about you beginning to hear and do what he says. And when we met, we used to do you remember we used to talk about ED, not ING?
Yeah.
That your desire, and it seemed impossible, didn't it, John? Because AA talks about being in recovery and forever recovering.
Yes.
And we call that ING. And you said to me one day, I don't want the rest of my life to be framed by the absence of alcohol. I want to go from ING to ED. And we talked about that a lot. And one day you came to see me, and at the end of our session, conversation, you went out to the car. I think it was raining a bit that day, and outside the church was a one-way street, and you drove up, and at the end of the road was this flatbed truck in the middle of the road. Do you remember?
Yes.
And you were sitting there in the car waiting for it to move. This is by hearsay. Tell us the story. Tell us the story, because you were there.
I can't remember it vividly, to be honest with you. Can you just jog my memory?
Yeah. And you were sitting there, and there was a tarpaulin draped over the back of the flatbed, over the back sort of plate of the flatbed, and it was a gusty day, and suddenly a gust of wind blew, and it revealed two letters on the end of and it just said ED.
Yes.
And I remember you ran back, you left the car there in the street with the engine running, door open, ran back to the church, banged on the door, and I opened the door, and you burst into tears.
Yeah.
And you said to me, you almost fell on me. And I said, "What's wrong? What's wrong?" And you said, "I think God's just spoken to me. I think he's told me ED is possible." And then you told me the story. And I went, "Wow, John, that's amazing." Because what are the chances? What are the chances that we've just had that conversation and that should happen?
Yeah.
And there were several things like that over the course of the next few years, weren't there?
Yes. Yes. I remember there was a hip hop singer called Lauryn Hill.
Yes.
Who produced an album called The Miseducation of Lauryn Hill, which was very well received, and
Yeah.
there was a bonus track on there. I'm not even sure if it's supposed to be on the album, called Tell Him. Um, and I really struggle without getting emotional to play that song to this day, because the lyrics to that song, tell him I need him, it'll be all right. It just gives me a lot of comfort just thinking about it
Yeah.
now.
Yeah. I remember you telling me that it described you as you had been perfectly. And it also felt like, at the time, it felt like Jesus was singing it to you.
Yes. Yeah.
And I just thought that was awesome. I think you'd been driving along the motorway when it came on, because you thought
Yeah.
the album had ended. It was the first time you'd ever listened to the album,
That's right.
and
Yeah.
there was a pause, and then suddenly it came out of the blue.
This thing came on. Yeah. I think they call it a bonus track or something. I wasn't
Yeah,
even aware it
yeah.
was on there.
It was very trendy at the time to do things at the end of track albums at the time, wasn't it?
Yeah. And I
Yeah.
remember you very kindly allowed me to play it in one of our
Oh,
evening
yeah.
sessions.
Oh, it was amazing.
There's a
Yeah,
lot of
it was.
power there. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, 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 yeah. So John, that was a long time ago, and this is now, and a lot more water has gone under the bridge since then.
Yeah.
So, and this is why it's a delight to connect with you, really. What's life like now? Where are you at, and how are things?
Well, I'm sitting talking to you today. I'll be 68 in August. I've not had a drink since the 2nd of September, year 2000, or a bet since the 27th of October 2006. And I think, following on from Dr. Bob and Bill W., who put together this program, this 12-step worldwide famous program of an alternative way of living. If only you just come to faith and accept that you are not the arbiter, you are not in charge, and that God is. Thank God they didn't keep it to themselves, Richard, and they passed on the program. And I believed, as I continued to get well, that it was my job to do just that. And about 11 or 12 years ago, I was taken on by an addiction treatment centre, and now qualified to work as an addiction counsellor, to give back really what was freely given to me, and that's what I continue to do. I have to say, another God incidents, if you like, my little boy who went to live in Johannesburg when he was 5, is not only back living in this country, but is now living in the next road to me with his wife and 2 children, my grandchildren. I'm present in their lives in a way that I was never present before. I was present but not present. I think you'll understand what that means. Certainly not emotionally available to him as I am now. I want for nothing. I live, shall we say, I'm not life in the fast lane. I don't sit in wallow in self-pity and yearn for things I think I don't have. I have enough. I have a roof over my head. And I'm very grateful, Richard, for everything I've received. And as a way of keeping it, I'm giving it back. And I should continue to do that for as long as I can. So.
Fantastic. That's oh. That's fantastic. It's fantastic to hear. And it's amazing, isn't it? Because in a way, you didn't deserve any of that. I mean, that's just the pure, unmerited grace and favor of God, really, isn't it? That we've just started in the church looking at a verse that says, "Seek first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, and everything else will be added to you." And in a way, it could be a 12-step program motto, couldn't it? In a way, when you put God first, it's amazing how other things begin to sort themselves out.
Yes.
And it's an absolute delight and joy to me to hear you say that. Because I've often, over the years that we've been out of touch, I've often wondered what's happened to you. In fact, a couple of times I've tried to get hold of you and just didn't have the means of communication anymore. So, I've often wondered, and it was an absolute joy that you contacted me and told me, that you'd been 23 years or whatever, in a better place. And I'm just so delighted to get to know you again, John. I really am. So thank you. Thank you so much for what you've shared. I think that's really helpful. And I'm absolutely certain it will help others. So really appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much, Richard, and thank you for setting me on the road. Really, I think it wasn't until I met you that I realised that there had to be some intervention, and if I didn't take it seriously, that I might not be sitting here today talking to you. So
Yeah, no, an absolute privilege, absolute privilege.